All right, everyone, welcome in. It is 8:05 on this Wednesday evening, September 17th. Thanks for joining us. It seems some smaller flying friends are also taking the view from across the river. Skytrack Jeffersonville camera observing that sunset and the Louisville downtown skyline. As you're joining us here for tonight's edition of Wave Extra, always appreciate you doing that through our multiple stream options, Twitch, Facebook, X, YouTube, and of course on the Wave Now app, as we're sort of give myself a little bit more room there on the camera. I'm Jose Sosaya, walking through the things to unpack on tonight's menu of stories happening here in our community and elsewhere across our radar that we're checking in on. Some of the big stories wanted to get through perhaps this first part of the hour, because I hope you stick around for an in-studio discussion I'm going to have with Wave News reporter Alina Noakes, who was down there live in Nelson County in Bardstown for the official sentencing of two men for their convictions, their guilty convictions in the Crystal Rogers death and disappearance. Also pushing ahead to a longer conversation about what could happen next with our legal analyst, Leland Hulbert. But before we get to all that, some stories that we're keeping tabs on as we go about the rest of the night. Looking ahead, of course, there's a sheriff's office in North Carolina County who say they arrested an 18-year-old man for threatening to commit mass murder at the University of Louisville. So here in Kentucky, in our community, he was apparently upset over posters depicting conservative activist Charlie Kirk's murder. And this is a mugshot that we've received a copy of. According to an arrest warrant, Michael Tedder called the school, leaving a profanity-laced threat. We're paraphrasing to remove some of the expletives in the document itself. But the threat, for all intents and purposes, saying that the school will see hell and that we, from the suspect, will bring down the love of God. We will slaughter you, paraphrase there. Michael Tedder going on to write that, in paraphrasing as well as mentioning about the devil, that the victims would not know what he can do with an AR and an AK, blood, guts, and brains. Just a very graphic description based on the arrest reports and the records. Tedder is now being held on a $250,000 bond. He's due in court next Thursday. So not this coming Thursday, but next Thursday. And when it comes to those posters, which did generate a lot of pushback, outrage, and controversy, U of L said those were removed. The university is investigating what happened as far as who was behind posting that. Other updates tonight, a Louisville man was arrested because police say he tried to gouge a man's eye out to break up a fight. An arrest report says Devin Acevedo got into an argument with his girlfriend, Ellen Osborne, and then it got physical. It happened at the corner of Bardstown and Grinstead Drive. Police say Acevedo put the woman, Osborne, in a headlock, and that's when another man tried to break up the fight. Police saying Acevedo then attacked the man, hitting him in the face and knocking him to the ground. And that's when police say Acevedo tried to gouge the man's eyes out as Osborne kicked the man in the head. The attack apparently was caught on video. Acevedo and Osborne both arrested, charged with assault. The victim involved in the attack was taken to the hospital and had to have multiple surgeries on his eyes. What we don't know is if there was any permanent damage as of yet. Bringing you back in here to the studio as a setup for one more story I want to let you all know about. And this was a conversation our Wave News team had earlier today with the family of a 12-year-old boy. He died, unfortunately, after he was hit by a jet ski on Nolan Lake last year. And the family, his loved ones, are now asking communities, lawmakers to put in stricter boating laws. So our reporter, Fernando Garcia Franciscini, spent some time talking to the boy's mom today about the changes they would like to see out on Kentucky's waters. 12-year-old Keegan Peterson, he went to a lake house out on the lake with a friend, the friend's family last year. The family letting us know at Wave News that Keegan was on a tube. He was being pulled by a boat while the family's father was riding on a jet ski. They say the dad was looking down, did not notice Keegan's tube, and ran directly into it. Keegan's mom tells us, first responders, we're taking statements. We're looking at basic field sobriety tests around what happened. No blood test was required on the man who ran into Keegan. So the family, unfortunately, is never going to know if drugs or alcohol were involved in their son's death. And that's why they say they want to work with State Representative Ken Fleming to come up with what they want to call Keegan's Law.
We realize there's kind of a gap in the process that it would require now if there is a boating or jet ski accident that results in critical injury or death, that a blood test would be, part of the process and mandatory.
Keegan's family says they're going to present this bill to the state judiciary committee tomorrow in Frankfort. We'll certainly stay on top of whatever happens in the process or the development of this. The family also says that it is important for them to see meaningful change coming out of the tragedy. That's why they're also hosting a golf tournament later in the month to support two nonprofits here in Louisville that matter to them and for Keegan's sake to grow and develop youth soccer. Fernando will have much more on this for his full report on wave3.com for sure. As we're approaching the 8:11 mark, I want to let you all know that we do have a long part of our next 45 minutes or so to discuss the implications, the reaction, the processing of today's ultimate sentencing, life in prison for Brooks Houck, those 25 years for Joseph Lawson, the last two men to be officially sentenced for what happened to Crystal Rogers 10 years ago. So coming up after the break, letting you all know about these conversations in studio with our reporter, Alina Noakes, with our Wave legal analyst, Leland Holbert. So sit tight. We're going to be right back with much more on tonight's edition of Wave Extra.
I hope you enjoy your new life in prison because I feel like I've been there for the last 10 years of my life because of you. My only regret is that Kentucky doesn't have the death penalty. But then I think death is too good for you. Even if I never find my daughter, I know my daughter's with God. And that brings peace only He can give me.
Perhaps a moment many would only watch or read about, but for a community and this family, the twists and turns involved have been the reality they've lived for the past 10 years. And a decade later, two men convicted of murdering missing Bardstown mom of five, Crystal Rogers. They now know just how long they're going to spend in prison after a series of powerful impact statements, victim impact statements lasting nearly 45 minutes long. Wave News, by the way, from the very beginning this afternoon, covering from the morning through the early afternoon. And they're really from the beginning, since this all started July 3rd of 2015, the same day 35-year-old Rogers was last seen alive. 2 days later, her parents report her missing. The same day, her car's found along the Bluegrass Parkway, her belongings all still inside. Then July 8th, Brooks Houck, Rogers' boyfriend at the time, brought in by Nelson County deputies to be questioned. Nick Houck, Brooks' brother, was a Bardstown police officer then. He advised him not to talk to those detectives. On July 9th, Rogers is presumed dead, though her body was never found. If we fast forward to 2016, that's when Tommy Ballard, Crystal's father, is shot and killed on a deer hunt with his grandson. That death is still ruled a homicide. About 4 years later, August of 2020, the FBI takes over the investigation. Another 3 years pass, 2023. A special prosecutor appointed to the case says he's investigating that and Roger's father's death. So keep going further down the timeline, by the way. This is in August. 32-year-old Joseph Lawson arrested on conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with physical evidence. September 27th of 2023, the FBI arrests Brooks Houck. That December, Joseph Lawson's father, Stephen, taken into custody. He was the first to be convicted, already sentenced to 17 years in prison. Well, finally today, Joseph Lawson, Brooks Houck sat stone-faced, the judge handing down their sentences. Lawson getting 20 for the conspiracy charge, 5 for the tampering with evidence charge. Those are running consecutively. Houck, on the other hand, a life sentence for murder plus 5 years for tampering with the evidence. And unlike Lawson, those years will run concurrently. I want to bring in perhaps one of those key eyes and ears for us inside this entire process in both of the trials that we've witnessed this summer. That's our Wave News reporter, Alina Noakes. And Alina, it's really good to have you in here after what must have been an emotionally exhaustive day with perhaps a sense that this wasn't the ultimate closure, at least for the family who was there to support Crystal, but an opportunity that you might argue they've been waiting for 10 years for something like this.
Yeah, it's honestly incredible as you've read aloud just how much this family has gone through since 2015. Obviously, July of 2015, the last time that Crystal Rogers was seen alive. What happened that night exactly, still one of those things that the prosecutors and defense attorneys really debated during the trial. Obviously, we know that we've got a clearer picture painted for us from the trial, and that Brooks Houck was supposed to have taken Crystal on a date, but they ended up at the Houck family farm. Prosecutors have said basically that she went there and never returned home. But the last person definitively to have seen her alive and have been seen with was Brooks Houck. That night of July 3rd of 2015. So an emotional time, of course, since that date. And you read aloud the timeline for that. Just so much has happened over the last 10 years, but so much has happened just within the last 2 years, really, to help speed this to some sort of progress for this family. And even today, listening to what they had to say was kind of incredible to hear, because they still showed so much resilience in the face of their grief. I mean, I can't even imagine 10 years without knowing what happened to your family member, what happened to a mother of 5 kids, to just seriously to never have known past this point. Not to mention, obviously, we talked also about Tommy Ballard and his death shortly after his daughter went missing, and known to have searched for her every time he had an opportunity to. It's just so much tragedy for a family to experience. And yet their remarks today, on one hand, very measured. This is the first time they've been able to directly talk to Brooks Houck in at least the last couple of years since he's been in custody. But also saying things that maybe they wouldn't have been able to say before, making allegations they were not allowed to make from the chair under oath in a trial. So we heard a lot of that today.
And to your point, Alina, that sort of, there's no escaping having to be there by court order, because that is what you're supposed to do. If you're the defendant, you're supposed to sit there to receive your sentence. We were watching this as we were with you in real time, because just for folks to understand kind of what our process was today, Alina obviously there to gauge the folks' reaction and the sense of it all inside the courtroom. From us looking through the camera, it takes on a different life. I'm curious if you noticed some of you could call them the comments directly made, because in Sherry Ballard's case, and it wasn't just her, I know that has that sort of that eye-to-eye view for Brooks Houck in particular, but there were some comments that were absolutely piercing, and they not at all necessarily over the pale or something we couldn't air necessarily on TV, but just perhaps it tells you just the pain and the grief is still there.
Oh, very much so. And still so much, like we said, unanswered questions surrounding this case. It's more than just the grief. It's more than just not knowing where Crystal is to this day. It's also all the assertions that have been made against other people in Houck's circle, specifically his brother, Nick, a former Bardstown police officer, and his mother, Rosemary Houck. Rosemary was in the courtroom today, along with her daughter, Rhonda McElvoy. Obviously, we know that just was it yesterday?
Yes.
The court, received a filing that custody would be solely hers of the shared child between Crystal Rogers and Brooks Houck. Obviously, that struck a very emotional chord today that was different than potentially what we've heard, or at least what I've heard on the stand during all of these hearings. Obviously, when you're in a trial, there are some things you can't say, or else you risk a certain level of defense motions against what's been said. When it comes to prejudicing somebody, an expert saying some things that a person can't say, vice versa, things like that. And so they were obviously very measured in their remarks. And that's one thing, actually, Kylie Fenwick, the daughter of Crystal Rogers, said she was the first to testify today in her victim impact. And that's one thing that she noted. She basically picked up her victim impact statement where she left off in trial of things she couldn't say, and levied some very serious allegations against the type of person, perhaps the type of father that Brooks Houck was. We heard throughout trial a certain level of favoritism potentially that he levied against his shared child with Crystal versus the other children she had. Sort of things like that. That was a talking point for Kylie Fenwick. And then also with Ashley Miller, her other daughter, both seeing kind of this reality of their experiences as children 10 years ago. So that's a lot of what we heard today.
In fact, if you want, Alina, I believe, is this a clip of Ashley we could play just to give folks a sense?
Yes. And I want to preface this beforehand. Ashley, I felt like I wish I could play more of her sound, to be honest. She gave a different kind of sound, a different kind of statement. It was very much so focused, and it's not to say that none of the other statements about from other family members were focused on Crystal. Don't get me wrong about that at all. But in a different kind of sense, she embodied what she felt like her mother was like, what she wanted Brooks to remember about her mom, and the kind of life she led, the kind of spirit she had, and how that has impacted their lives. Take a listen.
We will honor her every day through our words, our actions, and our lives. She is not gone. She is everywhere. She is always guiding us, inspiring us, and reminding us to stand strong, even in the face of the unimaginable loss. No matter how long you sit behind bars, she will always be greater than you.
So perhaps a bit of a strength there, Alina, at least to say, the opportunities there to, unleash whatever emotional kind of punch you would against now a convicted defendant, but perhaps they're speaking more so about what she learned from her mother.
And that idea of, I think that was emphasized, is you didn't win. No matter what you thought about this situation, no matter if you thought that, one thing that her sister, Crystal's sister, said is, you thought you could get away with it. You walked around with your head held high around this town like you had gotten away from it, away with it. But here you are sitting here in front of us, and it's very clear you didn't. And it was that kind of idea that Ashley was getting at, of you didn't take her spirit from us. We still continue on with that. And that's something Sherry talked a lot about as well, of the kind of strength that she's had to have as a mother to be searching for 10 years for her daughter, be searching for answers, for justice, and then to also be grieving her husband, who obviously the suspicion surrounding this case is that the Houck family had something to do with that as well. And so you've got just this matriarch of a family who's been leading her life with such heavy grief, but also that kind of strength. And so I think that was very a kind of thought that was carried throughout these.
For sure.
Sherry being, no mother should have to go through what I did, and to show this kind of strength to my children, but we will. And Ashley saying the same thing about how they know, as Crystal's kids, they will do the same thing for their families.
I wanted to get your thoughts while we still have you here live. And by the way, appreciate you joining us on the live stream, on all the Wave social media channels, on the Wave Now app, our reporter extraordinaire through the trial and now this process for the sentencing, Alina Noakes. Was it hard to not listen into what perhaps the conversation was, and I know it necessarily no one is talking so much to have a deep discussion once the judge is left, court is adjourned. I'm just curious if, by the time you were still sort of gauging what people were, embracing, talking about, sharing, if they had questions that they want answered next, because we know some of those questions are still floating out there. I know I don't have the video necessarily up, but I would encourage you all to make sure to visit the website, and Alina's reporting there to Tommy's brother, Mike. And as someone you've talked to one-on-one before, him sort of, being part of this family coalition to take on the cause for justice for Crystal and her father. I was having this discussion with Leland earlier this afternoon that this feels like, even though we know how long Brooks Houck or Joseph Lawson will be in prison, that the story's not over. No. If Mike Ballard's accusations, prosecutors or investigators think there's some worth to this.
Oh, absolutely. That's something that I kind of left off with as well in that conversation with our content tonight. It's very much not over. I think that prosecutors have made that very clear throughout trial. A lot of, like we said, unindicted co-conspirators for Nick and Rosemary in all of this. Obviously, there's at this point allegations. No charges have come from those allegations as of now. But on top of that, still the unanswered questions especially for the whole family, honestly, but Mike Ballard has really taken this upon himself as well. This was his Tommy Ballard, his brother. This is something that has just, it's hard to say, where do you put that? It's been like they've been looking forward to justice for Crystal, fighting for that. And it's very clear that this is not a kind of fight that is letting up anytime soon. And I think that you could say that investigators feel the same way, and they've been investigating Tommy's case since it happened as well. I don't think that changes just because this case has now come to an end.
And while you were out there, Alina, get a sense, I was just curious in the way sort of the dynamic was a certain way in that for the women who came up, and obviously it wasn't just them, but the group of people who came up to share their victim impact statements. Leland and I might have been discussing this. It perhaps was evident to you and to the folks who tuned in to watch that most of the ire was directed at Brooks Houck, save, give or take, a couple mentions of Joseph Lawson, despite obviously, the punishment the judge agreed with is quite serious given, what the jury agreed was so the case for Dad Steve and son Joseph. But just the sense that perhaps most of the boiling, simmering resentment was toward Brooks Houck and not necessarily Joseph Lawson, even though he was there for the same time through the whole motion of the trial. Yeah,
I would say that was very interesting to me, just how much was not directed at Joseph Lawson today. It almost felt like an afterthought a lot of the time. Not saying it had that kind of weight as an afterthought. It just felt like that at times. It was either the very first person they addressed or the very last person they addressed. And I heard this multiple times that he got his karma. I think Casey Ballard said that, this is as much as I think of you, is that they can roll you out in your wheelchair to the dumpster outside. Like, it was very much a write him off kind of comments directed
dismissing
his
him
way.
Almost.
Yeah. And I think I get this idea from talking to some of the family members that there were some people who knew him and then some people who really didn't. You hear people who knew Steve a little bit more perhaps than Joseph Lawson, but it kind of was this person who, until this case, was not really known to this family. So to them, like I think I said this in one of my one of the shows tonight, where it was very personal for the family when it came to Brooks Houck. And not to say that it's not personal for Joseph Lawson, but they had a lot they wanted to say to Brooks Houck and have not been able to say for the last several years. And for Joseph Lawson, it was really simply for them, you could have told us, you could have helped her at the time, and you could have told us where she was at. And now we just think this is what you deserve. That's definitely the idea.
So already, Alina, just about the difference in, to the extent of the punishment that both of these men are now receiving. And there are some distinguishing, some things to differentiate how Brooks Houck's sentence is carried out versus Joseph, still both for quite a long time. And perhaps if that's something, I think I'm not saying we take for granted that they're going to try to appeal this, as far as they can, but
Yeah,
both of their
I would say
punishments,
So I would say with Joseph Lawson, he being that he is disabled, I think they talked about the fact that the Judge Sims, is going to sign off on a motion for him to have a public defender represent him up to the appeals process all the way up to the Supreme Court. So that's something you have to get an exception for. Steve Lawson, I believe, made the same motion
yes.
as well following his sentencing. It's not necessarily something that happens past the trial phase of a case. Appeals usually cost money and then a different attorney.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know at this point what's going to happen with Houck at the moment. I would say the differences in the sentencing, obviously we heard that 25 years for Joseph Lawson being consecutive. That's 20 on the conspiracy, 5 on the tampering. And that was something the judge brought down. It was a little bit different. I think I tried explaining this in the 4 o'clock after it first happened. And I don't think I did a very good job at trying to explain
it's
the
just a lot of information coming all at
and
once.
what the judge was trying to say in the courtroom when he was basically addressing the fact that he had to disregard what the jury's recommendation was. He said basically that it's usually what he does is follows a jury's recommendation, and rarely will he go against what a jury has said. But in this case, it didn't agree with Kentucky law, and so he had to. And he was only saying that in regards to the fact that they wanted life for the principal to murder charge and 5 years on the tampering, which is the maximum of tampering. And he said, I can't do those as consecutive, which is what they had asked for. So he made them concurrent.
Mm-hmm.
I tried making that distinction. I don't think it came across very clearly. That's what I was trying to say. But essentially life. So that's still what the sentence is, but just a slight distinction from what the jury had recommended.
Was there even the discussion or the specter of with a punishment like that, Alina, that again, do you take for granted? Does parole when's the threshold of even talking about parole? And I know we're thinking way down the road, which as we're discussing this too, there's also the matter of the civil lawsuit that Crystal Rogers' estate brought against Brooks Houck, which is probably something we'll also keep following up.
Sure.
I don't know what that timeline is going to be, but just to say that and perhaps in Houck's case, he might have the resources to take care of his own appeal that way. And we were discussing this with Leland, that he would probably take that route for sure.
Sure. I think that's fair to say. Parole eligibilities will be a little bit different now, especially under new laws when it comes to felonies. So I think that's something to be taken into account here. As far as, how successful they'll be, I'm not quite sure at this point. I don't think anybody really is. And what the direction they'll take this, I think that's up to just letting the appeals process play out, which can be a lengthy one, a tiring one for victims and their families. So obviously we will continue to be watching that as that moves forward. Both defendants in this case, Houck and Lawson, made a motion for an acquittal or a new trial. Both of those dismissed outright by the judge. They didn't really argue that in court today. They had submitted their briefs beforehand, so that's something that was just discussed in the briefs. I wanted to include this. I found it interesting that as I was listening to Sherry Ballard, she spoke the longest of anybody in her victim impact statements. And it was about 25 minutes, if I timed it out right, saying everything she couldn't say for a long time that she was finally saying. But I noticed a trend. She started talking directly about the motion for an acquittal or a new trial, addressing each point. And I said, she has been paying, not to say that she doesn't ordinarily, but I just found it interesting that in a victim impact statement, she went very pointed through each point that he thought, the reason why he thought that he should get his case thrown out was because of these things. And, at one point it was the fact that the jury had been prejudiced, is what he argued. The jury in Warren County had been exposed to this case, so therefore it wasn't appropriate for them to take it up.
Which, remember, the context being they moved this to Warren, or at least to have a Warren County jury, because they already felt like a Nelson County jury was going to be compromised.
Exactly. So it was kind of that argument. And she said, basically, I don't know why you're arguing that, as if a jury couldn't find that over the 10 years and the lies you've you've made, that they would not see through those. And I just thought that was interesting, kind of the direction she took her victim impact statement, mixing it in with everything else she wanted to say. Yeah, I just thought that was an interesting
I hear you.
observation.
Before I let you go, what was your sense the further you were kind of able to walk with that crowd out of the courthouse? What was the overarching sense or mood or discussion at that point? Because we'd obviously, checked in with the Bardstown community as well.
Yeah.
And for those who felt that kind of sense of or the weight or the pressure off their shoulders, wanting for some answers and some support for Crystal Rogers' family, of course. But was it a continuation of the same kind of feeling when they learned the verdict when we were there at the courthouse with them?
I would say yes, almost with maybe a little more finality. Definitely a sense of relief that I hadn't seen on some of their faces before, because this was like that final step. They're going to still have to go through the appeals process if Houck and Lawson choose to appeal. But that finality of this is the moment, and hearing that judge, give this life sentence and the 25 years, just the finality in this case. But, definitely not over. And they've said that as well. They believe, as far as any other prosecution, they think that will come. That was something that was said in victim impact statements. They are very much on board to track this case, as you'd expect, throughout the appeals process as well. That was a statement made in court as well. We will be tracking this case. We will be at every single hearing, every parole hearing, appeals hearing, anything you have to argue against it. And I think that there was just a certain level of relief that I hadn't seen before in the faces of some of the family members, and definitely just a little bit more, a lot more hugging, a lot more just, I don't know.
A sense of embracing each other.
A sense of embracing, yeah. Instead of, I feel like for a while, even after, Steve Lawson and then Joey and Brooks, the trial phases, and even with the recommendations, it was a sense of holding your breath and waiting to see what would happen next.
Okay.
So I think it was a sense of relief is the best way to put it. There's not really any other word. I think that would best come from the family themselves.
And I think finality also, I understand when you're saying finality, just because it's almost like the last breath of the word uttered by the judge to say this part of it is done.
Yeah.
This part of it.
Especially because comparing it from the very beginning, before the hearing started, when Brooks, Houck, and Joseph Lawson walked in, I described it as it was so quiet. And it really was. It was very quiet in the courtroom, whispers amongst family, but not even that, as soon as everybody kind of filed in, before they even walked in the room, it was just quiet. And I think the air was charged, and then I changed towards the end. It didn't feel as much like that anymore.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, obviously, for being there, Alina, and being our eyes and ears and understanding what obviously the case has meant on a grander scale, because so many people were interested in just the mystery of it. And here we are, 10 years after that date where Crystal went missing, and to arrive at this point for the family, that semblance of closure, and to say, obviously, when we discuss the story is not over, because presumably Crystal's family will want to find the same kind of justice for Tommy Ballard still out there.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, for Crystal as well, there's still that one unanswered question about where she is. And I think they're just, they won't get, without that proper burial, without that final sense of closure, this won't be fully resolved.
Sure.
Yeah.
And whatever happens from there, we'll certainly hope to find out and let you all know what that next development is. Our Wave News reporter, Alina Noakes, here in the studio. Alina, thank you so much.
Of course.
We're going to take a break. And after the break, I'm going to play for you my conversation with our Wave News legal analyst, Leland Hulbert, to also break down kind of the implications of today's official sentencing, the punishment for Brooks Houck and for Joseph Lawson and Crystal Rogers' death. So we'll take that break and be right back. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on tonight's edition of Wave Extra here in the Wave Now studio on a big day, of course. That's why we bring in insight and breakdown from our Wave legal analyst, Leland Hulbert. Leland, always appreciate you. And on a day where, I guess you say this is kind of the closing chapter in the process of the case. We were obviously, earlier today discussing the official sentencing for both Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson. And coming into it, the expectation was, the jury had recommended the max punishment for Brooks Houck of life in prison. I believe for Joseph was 20, and there was the breakdowns of concurrent serving as well. No reason to have believed coming into this afternoon to the official sentencing, Leland, that was going to change necessarily if the judge was going to take up what the jury had recommended.
No, this judge has pretty much done everything by the book that I can tell throughout this trial. And I think the last thing a judge wants to do in a higher profile case is to take some, step outside of what he would normally do, because then you're asking for a lot of scrutiny. And I think, as the judge said at sentencing, I don't typically go against the jury's recommendation. So there was no apparent reason to here.
Okay. Put us, in your shoes for the audience, watching us, just to get a sense of all the different types of courthouse situations you've been in. I was going to ask, at this point in your practice, how long have you been working as a defense attorney?
About 10 years.
Okay. Fair to say you've seen your different nuances of, from the start to the beginning of a process, coming into courtrooms for sentencings. I also know you were here with us to kind of watch today's proceeding play out. Are there still things that stick out to you as far as unique characteristics and nuances of what happened?
Well, from being on both sides as a prosecutor and defense attorney, you have different thoughts and emotions. So the prosecutors, would love for him and the victim's family to get some true closure, say what they did with the body, admit to what they did, give more information that people will never have unless they come forward. And that's a chance for some mild redemption for them and to help the families when they've chosen to hurt the families for so long. But that's not going to happen when there's an appeal. So if appeals are pending, you're not going to get an apology for something that someone thinks they're trying to show you they didn't do. You apologize, you're pretty much admitting some form of guilt. So I'm assuming they're not going to do anything. I think some sentencings are powerful when the defendant does step up and apologize. And maybe he will someday, maybe he won't. His lack of emotion today seems to be pretty consistent with what we've seen during the trial. And you can read into that what you will. As a defense attorney, I would likely advise my client not to say anything because an appeal is pending. So for the same reasons, I can see why everything happened today. It was pretty standard. The victims got their chance to say some things directly to him, which this will probably be the only chance for that. His lack of emotion is probably something that they're going to remember and judge him for. And people will as well, but you're not going to find a defendant apologizing for something that's on appeal. And
you might even argue, as their counsel would advise, that it's the pragmatic thing, perhaps, if they're going to seek the appeal, which by all accounts I think they will exhaust those options. You and I have discussed that. The impression is they're going to continue to appeal as much as they can.
When you get the maximum, you literally have nothing to lose. So I'm assuming, especially if he still has any resources that he can get to, or his family has any resources, they will very likely appeal.
I wanted to ask you, just perhaps of you being in a very informed position when you're sitting down in sentencings and you've reached this point where a jury has rendered its verdict. I'm just always curious if managing perhaps your processing of some really raw emotion, like we're hearing. Of course, in this case, it feels like it's got all of our attention, but in other cases, victims, still have these opportunities in the impact statements. I'm just curious if that's something as practicing attorneys, you still also, A, you can advise your client to only do so much, but B, you in that courtroom, how you're navigating the tension that's inside that room.
It's difficult. I don't think the prosecutors or the defense attorneys really enjoy this part of it. I'm sure the prosecution feels some sort of vindication, but it's difficult for a defense attorney to sit there and pretty much just take it. We're used to arguing, we're used to making an argument, we're used to putting forward our points of view, and that doesn't happen today. But I do appreciate the law and the way it gives victims a chance to finally speak to the person that is found guilty of doing something to their family, because obviously in a murder case, the main person is no longer with us. So giving the victims an opportunity to speak, an opportunity to say how heartbroken they are and how the last 10 years have been, and especially hearing from the children, you can hope if you're supportive of the victims here, you can hope that some of that resonated with him, and he'll have a lot to think about why he is in that cell that they described, the concrete walls and the bed and what he's likely looking at in prison. And then there's also the other factor of what kind of attention is he going to have in prison, because it's a popular case. I can't speak to exactly what's going to happen to him, but I would imagine all the other inmates are going to be real supportive of him if they believe that he did this.
I wanted to ask you if it's sort of worth noting how, and not that the victims who we heard come up to offer their statements wouldn't also direct some comments at either, father Steve Lawson or, the son Joseph Lawson in the case today. Does it make sense though that most of their anger, their commentary was directed at Brooks versus Joseph Lawson? And again, you'd say given, each of the counts they were found guilty of would sort of speak to their degree of guilt that the victims would attach to each of them.
Yeah, I think the general consensus, and you saw them even go after Houck's mother, they think the Houcks are the kings and the Lawsons are the pawns. And that's probably the mantra you're going to get the rest of this. The justice they seek, they probably feel more vindicated seeing what they believe is the main actor caught and a jury unanimously giving him the maximum sentence. It's not that they don't care about Lawson. It's not that they think Lawson is innocent. They're just going after the main target, which seems to be natural. I mean, it's kind of like, for a loss, you blame the coach, you don't blame the players. And so the person in charge of all this, they believe, is Brooks Houck. And so that's who's going to get the attention.
Okay. Obviously, there's, we now know what the court has set their respective punishments to be. I hesitate to say this is, the total ending of this book. If you're sort of been analyzing all the different, tangent investigations or questions that folks might still have, I don't know. And of course, I don't want you to have to speculate on something you may not know of, but it sounds like, even with us discussing the story, we can expect the appeals. What more could come of this, even as both Mr. Houck and Mr. Lawson might be serving their sentence in prison?
Yeah, appeals are difficult because it's still more for the family to go through. And you hope as a prosecutor or victim's family that nothing comes of it. And, without cameras being in the room and without us being to analyze every single decision and ruling that was made, it's difficult to say that if there's ripe issues for appeal. I can tell you that many cases that get appealed never go anywhere. And then obviously some do. I mean, some you hear about, judgments get overturned, cases have to get a retrial. I don't anticipate that happening here, but they're going to find their best arguments, and it'll depend whether or not they have private attorneys or the Department of Public Advocacy, which does a lot of appeals for people that are in custody with no more funds. So, I'm sure some good arguments will be made. The question is, does it rise to that high level of undoing what this jury did? And I wouldn't think that's likely.
For sure. One thing that just popped in my head too was, there's perhaps the feeling of some resolution in criminal court, but maybe you and I have talked about sort of when the civil case was brought up, and Sherry Ballard is an integral part of bringing that as far as the putting in that appeal to the court to prevent at least the Houck estate from the selling of those assets. I'm curious, what kind of timeline could we now expect if we're going to be paying attention to what plays out in civil court over that lawsuit?
Well, with civil court, obviously there's statute of limitations, and a lot of times it's 1 or 2 years, and this was 10 years ago. And those statutes change based on what happened, based on evidence. And that's really not my area of expertise as far as civil law. But if a case has been filed and orders have been entered as far as releasing property or not allowing the Houck family to dispose of property, you would expect those to be followed, or there would be, major problems. There could be contempt. People could be put in jail. But, a lot of people know the OJ case. I mean, obviously he was found not guilty, and then he had to have a civil judgment of, I don't know, 30, 50 million, whatever it was, tons of millions of dollars over his head. So potentially that could happen here. And they'll go through the whole rigmarole again of, well, what insurance companies that he had, what are his assets, can they do the trial in Nelson County? So that's likely another road, but they can feel like they've gotten, I guess, gotten some close. I don't know if the case, and that's the thing. And speaking with victims, today is probably a good day for the victim's family, but I don't know if it's ever truly closed. There is some more closure. But you speak to a lot of victims' families who's lost somebody, and today's a good day, but it's still a tough life. They still have to follow his prison. They have to go to Crystal's gravesite. It's not like they're happy.
And think about
the
children and
Right.
their lives after the fact, right?
They may feel some satisfaction today, but it's probably not happiness.
For sure. Anything, I'm trying to think, as far as, I'm trying to think even short term, we were discussing the appeals, but mid and long term, anything that you would want to let folks know is something worth looking into? Because I hesitate with as much energy and coverage as this case is merited that the pin is fully closed on a case like this.
Well, I mean, I think you could see another documentary. You could see, you're going to find out some things with the appeals, but there's nothing bigger than this trial. There's nothing bigger than the verdict. I don't think you're going to get anything more newsworthy than that. There might be some bits and pieces. And if there's some Hail Mary appeal that ends up working, obviously that would be a huge story. But, I think people just they can probably follow the money. If the Houcks were that wealthy and have that many properties, I think people will be interested to see what happens to it. I also think personally how people treat this family in Nelson County, because I think people probably were guarded, not knowing what they did, and probably a lot of pent up anger and, judgment will happen to this family. And that something could come of that. And then what everybody keeps asking me and everyone else is Rosemary. Is she going to be charged? Are there other Houcks that are going to be charged? And that's really a question for the prosecution.
Excellent. All right. Well, I always appreciate your insight and at least understanding the possibilities, but within how the system works. So always appreciate our Wave legal analyst, Leland Holberg, joining us here at the Wave Now studio desk. By the way, more of this coverage, including this conversation, prior conversations Leland and I have had, and through the course of the trial, whatever comes of appeals down the road, we'll certainly be here to break that down with you all. We're going to take a quick break and be right back after this commercial break on Wave News Extra. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on tonight's edition. All right, everyone, welcome back. As we sort of round out for tonight, as we get closer to the 9 o'clock hour, a reminder that on our homepage of wave3.com, all the day's top stories updated here, very high up for you. Of course, the big story in our coverage of the day, life sentence for Brooks Houck, those 25 years for Joseph Lawson in the Crystal Rogers trial and murder case. Plenty of other stories that we're following here. If you keep scrolling down, go through all the different tabs. A reminder that in Waves Originals and in our submenus, of course, all of our past documentaries, reports, interviews, coverage about the Crystal Rogers case there for you to look at, especially on the Wave Now app as well. Certainly something to refresh yourself of all the twists and turns that the case and these trials have now led to ultimately with those sentences for not just Brooks Houck, but Joseph and Steve Lawson as well. We'll leave you tonight with one more look at our downtown Louisville skyline from across the river from our Jeffersonville Skytrack camera, looking at the cars crossing that bridge traffic. A reminder, we're going to have more tonight for you on Wave News at 11. So we do appreciate you checking in with us for the Night Owl crowd. If you will want to check in on our reporters doing their investigations, our Logan Perrone, our Julia Richardson, and of course, Chief Meteorologist Kevin Harned, letting you know what to expect as we get ready for Thursday. Thursday, by the way, which has Louder Than Life already getting going, and it's going to start pretty soon, just the weekend ahead, and discussing what the first inklings of fall will feel like for us here in Kentucky and Southern Indiana. That's going to do it for us. Appreciate you all. Take care. We'll see you back here tomorrow night at 8:05.